Okay. I guess I'm okay with that. Um, so, welcome everybody to the Hollywood Squares. I'm joined by Terry, Stephanie, Paul, Scott, and Christine. Hope y'all are having a great Monday morning. Um, Stephanie made a comment just a little while ago, something about Weezer. I don't know what Weezer is. What is? Did I get it right?
It's a
Weezer.
band. It's a
It's one of the
band.
coolest bands of the 90s.
Like the
Hello?
blue album, the green
Yeah,
album,
yeah.
the red
This
Terry, did you know
album.
what Weezer is?
Paul,
I know the name. I don't know the band.
yeah.
Paul, you have
The,
to
They,
the
school everybody.
yeah.
I think
They
the song they're most known for is the Buddy Holly song, right? Is that the most
There you go.
famous
That yeah,
Weezer song?
that's
yeah.
one of them on yeah.
And
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and for historical perspective, they did steal their blue album cover idea from a band called the Feelies. So I
Interesting.
have that one up to
Of
my
course Paul knows that.
left.
All right. Well, I hope everybody's having a wonderful Monday. As I said, I'm excited that we have the whole gang back together today. We have some really good topics that I think we're going to get to. And I think one or two of these topics may spur some additional conversations. So I know Paul is coming out of his Super Bowl haze. Congratulations to you and your love of Philadelphia sports. I'm not going to get into it. I'm happy to say that it's nice not to see a three-peat for the Kansas City Chiefs. But hey, to all you Chiefs fans, I'm sorry. There's always next year, and you got a young Patrick Mahomes who's a incredible individual, great football player, but
And
their
a little
offense,
sore today.
yeah, their offense could not hold up to the pounding of the Philadelphia defense. So with that
Let's
said,
get
talking about defense, sometimes Stephanie Allard, as an external auditor, and Terry Fletcher and Christine Hall, we have to play defense because all of us, including Scott and Paul and myself and the lovely ladies, we get retained by um, different physician group practices, hospital networks, health systems to provide audit services for these organizations. And as independent, objective third party auditors who take pride in the services that we render for our clients, we follow authoritative guidance. We follow the Code of Federal Regulations. We follow what's in the Social Security Act. We follow local coverage determinations, local coverage articles, national coverage determinations, medical coverage policies. But sometimes we run into a situation where all of that doesn't matter. So Stephanie, this was your great topic. I want to give you an opportunity to take us down this road and let's see where it takes us.
Okay, so the reason I brought this up is it's been frustrating lately when working with clients who basically want to put you into their square, right? They want you to come in, maybe validate what it is that they've been doing up to that point. And, if you try to go in, let's say, and structure your comments a certain way so that you can get a point across to, a method that works for providers, for example. Or if you're working with a group and you have these findings and they're upset that there's E&M variances, but when you look at the policies and what they've been following internally, you know that that's going to be problematic on an external review. So it's really important that when anybody's bringing in external consultants, auditors, which should be a part of the process to get this feedback, you need to remember that we're looking from the viewpoint of what we typically have to do on the defense side. So we're not there to come in. It's great when we can just validate what is already there, but we have to have that objective perspective. We need to be the ones that when things do get subjective, we're able to offer you our opinion, our guidance, the reason why we think things should be a certain way. And there's just too much pushback at times. And, it gets frustrating to me, especially with larger organizations. You know that they need to check that box, but they also need to be open to what it is that they're going to find out and what that means to changing workflow and all of those specific things.
Yeah. So, Terry, and I can't help but to laugh. Terry and I have this wonderful friendship, wonderful brother sister where she loves to hate me. And Terry's aggravated with me today, and it's okay. And it doesn't matter why. It's all okay. So if you see occasionally me laugh about something, it's just a sideshow. So, Terry, listen, I get emails from you, I get text messages from you on a regular basis where you've been retained to do something, you've been asked to do something, and you send me these emails and you're like, is it me? Or what the heck? I'm going to use
do
very
get
mild
those.
language. You know, have you ever given feedback or guidance to a client? Because I know you give feedback and guidance to me all the time, but have you ever given feedback and guidance to a client and they just looked at you and they said, I don't care? Did you
Yes.
ever, how did you handle that? What do you do in
Well,
those situations?
Actually, Christine and Stephanie and I are working on a joint project over the next long period of time. And we got a list from said client saying, well, this is how we handle things. And then as we're auditing, we're like, well, you can't handle it that way. That's not appropriate. Or we'll see something, you know, not just that client, but other things. And I get all the time. They said, well, my doctors want to do this, but I don't think that's right. Can you tell me, am I right or am I wrong? And I get staff saying the same thing. They say, am I right? Am I wrong? Is it me? And I say, no, it's not you. And I know you and I will dive into something tomorrow on behavioral health, which is always a fun topic. But and Stephanie and I have had conversations with clients on the, you know, diet drugs and things and how to handle things. Sometimes, and this is interesting because we're all compliance people here, in addition to our auditing, coding, billing, whatever our backgrounds are. But people don't seem to think that, or don't seem to understand, in my opinion, that compliance doesn't mean you're setting policies to make things work the way you want them. Okay, you're setting policies to make sure you're working within the published guidelines and regulations that said this is how things are done, and then work it into your workflows. And I think, and I'm positive Scott's dealt with this, and so is Paul, is that we get a lot of clients, and I get them every day, that say, well, that's all nice and good, but this is how we do it. I'm like, okay, but let's back up the train a little bit. That's not how it's done. That's not appropriate, not only for, you know, the payers, but also for your patients, because, you know, this is the problem. I have one in particular. I'm an external consultant for a very, very large organization that is actually an association, and I won't name them because they might get mad. But that some of the instruction sometimes is interesting because I know sometimes the associations out there, whether it be orthopedic or primary care or whatever it is, family practice, whatever, is to help find revenue opportunities for their clients and their base, right? But there are things out there that have been created by Medicare, by payers, such as preventative services, screenings, things like that, that do not come with an out of pocket for a patient. Okay, so annual well visits, you know, certain screenings for whatever, depression, whatever. And I'm seeing guidance, or I should say, I'm seeing instruction by some bodies that are telling practices, oh, well, if you refill meds, you also get this, and you can bill an extra this. Or if you do this, you can bill an extra this. The problem with that instruction is that now you've changed what the intent was from the payer, mostly government, to for the patients, to encourage them to come in for these preventative well checks, these screenings, so that you're trying to avoid the sick appointments, and you're encouraging now, or you're basically discouraging them from coming because they're going to have an out of pocket. And so it's very unfortunate because a lot of the language is gray. You know, I see a lot of even consultants out there that, you know, I may or may not be involved with, or have a relationship with, that are like, well, it's kind of, yeah, you could kind of bill that, kind of. You either can bill it or you can't. And I see a lot of that. Well, it reminds me of my sister-in-law. She does this to my brother whenever they have an argument. She's like, well, actually, I hate that phrase. Well, actually, no, don't say that to me. So I'm going to throw it over to Scott, because Scott, I'm sure you've read things that this is really a well check, or it's a preventative, or it's something that should just be a non out of pocket for a patient. And you see a little blurb that they're trying to push in. It's probably even a drop down to get that extra visit. And now the patient's got an out of pocket.
Yeah, I see that all the time. The comment I wanted to make about this topic in general is that there is no more dangerous position to be in as a person than to have a pile of money or any amount of money and endeavor to spend it on the opinion of another person. And the reason I say that is, at some point you will find somebody who tells you what you want to hear. And I've worked with some groups, and the thing I'll say about the bigger health system sometimes, and I understand this, right? Like, I think the work we do in compliance is, there's a subjectivity to it. Like, if it were easy to look at a medical note and always land in the same place, this work wouldn't be very difficult. And so philosophically, when we work in compliance, we believe certain things. And that's what I get into when I said before, right? So in theory, if you're going to go out and solicit opinions, and you say, well, I have X amount of money, I'm going to get some opinions on this. I guarantee you can find somebody who will agree with you if you try hard enough, no matter what you believe. I'll give you an example of something I dealt with recently. Clone notes, right? So clone notes, or copy carry forward notes, are somewhat subjective in a way, right? Like, what does it mean to carry forward things? And so I was working with a group, and I did not take any of this documentation because there were no updates to the plan of care. And to me, that's kind of the reason we do the work in the first place, right? Like, and so the client came back and said two things to me which were interesting. One was that the provider did document that they had looked at labs for the patient from the previous day, and they had added one word to the subjective with regard to the patient's condition. And I said to them, I'm like, well, how is it that they do that part of the work, but there's nothing else the provider needs to say with regard to the patient's condition? So we just did all that, and then we said, well, we don't need to do anything. And obviously that fell into the discussion we've probably all heard before. Is it okay to just carry everything forward because everything is legitimately the same as it was before? And that sort of became a separate conversation about having that conversation with the provider. And I've had tough conversations with providers before, so if I need to have it, I'll have it, right? But I think it speaks to the philosophies of auditing, of consulting, of sharing opinions about how this work should be done. And so I think, I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but if I were to wind this into guidance, right? Like, whenever you engage with any sort of consultant, with any sort of opinion, it's important that you have philosophical alignment, and more importantly, it's important that you can hear tough news or news that you didn't intend to hear. Like, my biggest thing about the bigger health systems, this is the last thing I'll say about this, is the bigger health systems like for everything to be the same and consistent. And I understand that in a way, because you're trying to make decisions across a 500 provider universe or maybe more, but that leads to sometimes bad decisions. So we had one group that said, what if we put in the note a statement that says, I read everything and nothing changed, and so I'm just putting in this default statement that I didn't change anything, right? That'll cover it. Or
Which
they
also
don't have to,
won't change, right, Scott?
yeah, or
That
they don't have to
statement will just go forward.
yeah, and I think what happens is it's the easy path instead of the right path, because you can sell it to a group of coders and billers and providers. It's always the same, but that isn't really how compliance works.
Right. So, Christine, I know you have a comment and something to add or an example, but I want to also stretch this a little bit further than just consulting for a practice, hospital, or health system. I want to take it a step further, because there's a lot of people that listen to us who function in the capacity of a consulting or testifying expert in administrative, civil, or criminal proceedings. And, you know, there have been times where I've been asked by a counsel to, you know, they've said to me, well, can you just say this? The answer is no, I can't just say that, because if the evidence and the facts and the published guidance don't point to it, I can't speak to it. I am not going to simply rely on the fact that I've done something for an extended period of time to come forward and say something. But more importantly, and I've said this to attorneys many times, I am not a hired gun. I will never say something because you're paying me to. I will say something because I could substantiate it. I could back it up, because at the end of the day, I'm the one sitting in that witness stand. It's my butt that's being cross-examined. It's my butt that could be impeached. And it is my butt that for future cases, it's jeopardized if something goes sideways because I put profit before doing the right thing. I won't do that. I've had many conversations with Scott, Stephanie, and Paul over the years where, you know, a client has suggested that we do something a certain way. And my comment has always been, if we can't support it, if there's no documentation, guidelines, if there's not something that we can revert back to, we can't justify it. We can't support it, because human nature tells me that they want us to say yes to the things that they want us to say yes to. But if something were to go sideways, they don't want the accountability or the responsibility. They want us as the quote unquote, hey, I hired Sean Weiss and his team said this, or I hired Terry Fletcher, or I hired Christine Hall. So we've got to be, we hold ourselves to a very high ethical standard, a high moral standard. And from my perspective, I won't say something because somebody needs me to. I say it because we could justify it. We could support it with authoritative information. So keep that in mind for those who are not just consulting for clients, but you're consulting or testifying as an expert in administrative, civil, or criminal proceedings. Because the last thing you want to do is find yourself lying on the stand. It's called perjury, or worse, being impeached on the stand, or having a Daubert motion filed against you in future cases, or motions in limine. That just destroys your credibility and it prevents you from being able to testify.
And I think it's such a good point, Sean, because I think we've all been asked at various times, whether it involves court testimony or not, to compromise the things that we believe are the right way to do things, to compromise how it should be, you know, and what about this? Is this acceptable? And I think, you know, I don't think it's right to you know, hire an expert necessarily to just simply affirm whatever it is you already believe. You should, you know, if that's the way it ends up, well, so be it, right? But I think you want to have a very deep dive look at your processes and your outcomes. And you know, once you start to compromise on these things, whether it's a reputation or how you do your work, it's kind of hard to get that back, right? There's just not a lot of shortcuts to it. And I know I have a lot more respect for people who are not willing to just sort of concede on these things. You know, you can certainly have a back and forth and be open to different ideas. But when people will say, well, can you just do this thing that's the opposite of whatever it is that you believe in, or starts to get into the, you know, integrity of the documentation, the integrity of the billability of the service. I mean, time is a good example. It's how many providers just lock in on time now, and you see these notes that are just they're just kind of junk notes. There's nothing in there that's new. There's nothing in there that's substantive, but somehow it took 45 minutes.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and before we get to Christine, because I know she's
Yeah.
got some added here, I just wanted to add one other thing, and keep this in mind, this to our listeners. Once we start seeing what you're willing to overlook, or once we start seeing you asking us to do this, then when things come up that you actually can do, but we think you would run with it in the wrong way, it's hard for us to want to bring to your attention. I think telehealth, oh my gosh, okay. And just some of the things, Christine and I taught a boot camp last week on telehealth. And as wonderful as the people were that we got, we did get a couple questions where we were just like, no, probably not that. But then you get a question, well, how can I bill it as a digital then? And how do I tell my doctor to make sure they get to that amount of time? I'm like, oh boy, that's like a doctor saying, well, how do I make that a level 5? That shouldn't be your question. And that we get that a lot. And Christine, I'll send it over to you because I know you've got some comments on this.
I was about to say, I think I should be complimented on how I didn't cut anybody off today. I'm working on that. That's my New Year's resolution, is to be more mindful of who's speaking. So that being said, I always have great passion about this industry. And I think that to take it back to the originating root of all of this is that since providers, doctors are not taught the business side of medicine, which I don't even understand, because every other profession is taught how to get paid. But providers are not. And for that, a lot of these docs, they're learning on the job, which is, again, very difficult to learn on the job. I'm glad they didn't learn their medical skills on the job, because that kind of would suck. However, I think what's important is that we've got to get to these providers. I had a talk with a doc this morning where I was saying, listen, this is not about your clinical approach. You're an amazing doctor. If I need that specialty, I'm definitely going to you. But that doesn't relay into the billing process. Like we've been saying, there are regulations, there are guidances for payment. So it's very black and white. If it's not in the documentation, then it's not supported from payment purpose, even if the docs had the best of intentions. And the other thing is, to piggyback off the copy paste that we've been seeing so much of, think about it this way. A lot of people hire a lawn service to come and fertilize and make their lawns look absolutely gorgeous, right? And you drive down the road and you see these perfect yards and you're just in total awe. Now imagine you hire that same company to come in and to service your lawn. And after week 1, there's nothing. Week 2, there's nothing. 2 months later, there's nothing. 6 months later, there's nothing. Why are you continuing to pay this lawn service? When we have copy paste and we say patients are exactly the same visit to visit, a payer is thinking to themselves, what am I paying you for if this person is not getting better, they're improving, there's stability in place? If it is the exact same visit over and over and over again, I think Einstein said that was insanity, right? And the last thing I'm going to leave it on is the other really big thing that docs don't understand is MACRA. So if you participate with Medicare, you have to prove to Medicare, how do you keep your Medicare patients healthier? And in return, Medicare either rewards you for that in the form of a bonus, BIPs, or through your ACO, or they penalize you. It doesn't mean that at every single visit, you're going to get paid for those measures that you've tasked to prove to Medicare that you're taking good care of your patients. A few months ago when you got that $100,000 payment from your MIPS or from your ACO, that's what that was for. So again, I think we do providers a big dissatisfaction by not teaching the business of medicine and academia. But docs, when you hire us to come in, listen to us. I will listen to you for any medical advice that's going to make me better. Please listen to us as we're giving you business advice to keep your practice functioning.
One thing I would just add to that, and I know this is something that I would say, especially to people who work in clinics as billers, as coders, but also to people who do consulting. Like I've been very thoughtful over the years about how I present things to providers, because it's very easy to say, this was done incorrectly, right? And that's this sort of very broad-based phrase, which, from the provider side, it's like, are they talking about how to practice medicine? And some of that is semantics. But, one of the things I always say at the outset is, what I'm doing is I'm assessing documentation and applying it to the rules that relate to the performance and documentation of services in general, or the performance of the specific service. I'm not in the room. If there are things that happen that weren't documented, I wouldn't be privy to those things. But we're really just assessing how you're presenting the information up against the rules that govern documentation and billing, whether they are rational or not, and they are not always rational.
Sorry, I was trying to. I couldn't click the unmute button. We got a question, and I want to pose this to the group because you can't see it on ours. For some reason, LinkedIn isn't coming into our studio. But here's the question. It's sort of a comment and then a question. We have a director who suggested we tell our providers to amend their 2023 date of service charts so we are not deleting non-validated codes billed. It's so difficult to stand our ground on what we coders know is a compliance issue. How should we handle this?
We're all
What does
shaking
that
our
mean?
heads. Like,
I
where
don't
do
know what
we
that
start?
means.
Yeah.
Are they saying, what are they
Well,
doing exactly?
They
I don't know what
want
that means.
to amend their note to support the code that should be removed because it's not supported.
Did
Right.
these claims
Absolutely.
already go out?
Well,
They
it's
were already billed?
I'm
2023.
assuming. Yeah.
Oh,
Ye-
no, no, no,
yeah.
no,
So
no.
yeah. So I mean,
That's an easy trail to follow. We can
yeah.
put it right down.
Listen. In all fairness to the person who asked this, right? This individual clearly understands that this is a compliance violation or a potential problem, right? What they're asking is, how do I tell this director what you're asking us to do is a problem? I have my thoughts, but I want to give it to the panel.
It's traceable. So however this was identified, let's say that you did an internal audit, a probe audit, just randomly looking around, you find a problem with a particular code.
And these are HCC chart reviews
Oh,
that were
great.
done.
Even
Oh,
better.
no.
There you go.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
Wow.
yeah, no, because the addendum's going to have the date and timestamp. So it's going to be
That's
very
right.
obvious that based on your review, information's missing. So that's no.
And
Yeah,
and
and
to
how did
quote
they
to
have the
you,
recall?
yeah,
This
How did they
question
have
is
the
easy.
recall of that patient?
Yeah,
How did
and
they know that they did another 10 diagnoses that
right.
were left out?
But Terry, I want to go to you because you and I had a very long conversation about metadata
Yeah.
and about individuals going into the medical record and manipulating information at a later date. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and we got probably the most feedback of any hashtag Terry Tuesday from that one. I mean, good feedback. People are just like, oh my gosh. And actually, shout out to Stephanie and Christine for finding this. I didn't even know it existed until they showed me. I'm like, oh, the hover thing. So when you're in Epic or you're in NextGen or you're in Cerner or any of these EMRs, there's a switch you can flip, and it's called kind of a hover, and you can see who populated the field in anything you do. Well, we're also finding that they don't have to turn on the switch for you to see it either, and they can just see it internally. So that's a little frustrating. But when you bring it to their attention, and then you see a lot of times where the office manager put some things in there to help out because they knew what the doctor meant to say. Oh my gosh. Or the medical assistant put something in there so that it looked better. Well, they just forgot it. I'm like, were you in the room? Were you even there at the time? They're like, no, but I know how much. I'm just like, all you had to tell me was no, and then we move on. But to answer the question, the person who put that in there, if you can even Google it. Just Google addendums, corrections, and late entries Medicare, and you will get everything starting with Noridian and all of the published guidance on that. And it specifically tells you how to do it. And then there's a little line towards the end that says, if it's been billed, you can't do it. Otherwise, it's changing and altering the record, and it's fraudulent because you're basically saying and trying to backtrack on something that was already seen. So it's
Something
man.
too, Terry, that scares me a little bit with that. Are they a part of an ACO or what? What is the motive of the provider to go into the note and do this? This isn't something that's probably attached to the payers, on the Advantage side. So what is their what is their motive financially to go in and do this?
My only modest defense that I will offer, because this comes up all the time, is the provider, to them, the remedy is they just fix it. And in their brain, they're like, how do I fix it? Do I just need to go into the note and write something? And you want to be like, no, 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 no. And I will say I run into that sometimes where to them it's like they don't know what we're doing behind the scenes in some cases, and their question is really just like, well, okay, how do I fix this? Like, how many times does that come up during an education call where you're telling them what's missing, and they'll just say, well, I just go in and add it.
All right. So I think we've answered that one pretty clearly. If any individuals have additional questions, feel free to post them. I'll make sure I convey it to the group. All right. So Terry, I want to come over to you now, because it seems like no matter how much we talk about TCM or some of these other ancillary type services, if you will, there seems to become more and more questions, more confusion, more folks sticking their toe over the line, if you will, as opposed to individuals performing the services as they're defined and billing for them as they're supposed to.
Yeah,
So
and
let me give it to you.
thank you. So I think one of the things, first of all, care management services are a great thing. We think that, they're supposed to be there to keep patients from readmissions. It's really a virtual way to keep on top of them. They're usually have time designated for them on how much time in a 30-day period you're spending. But the thing I think is missed, and if you want a chronic care management booklet, one that's very good, Christine has one at Sterling Global Solutions on her site. I bought it myself because it's just very good. But we're going to talk about transitional care management, because I've noticed that some providers are trying to build a practice with this, and it's making me a little concerned. And so, and also payers are starting to see that. And I've had a couple clients say, hey, we're getting a question on this from a payer. They want to know what they want past chart information that we knew this patient before, but we don't. So here's what TCM is, transitional care management. It means you have a patient in the hospital. Okay. They're either inpatient, observation, or at some designation in the hospital, maybe even skilled nursing or nursing facility, and they need to transition or discharge out to their domicile, their community, whether that be skilled nursing, whether that be at home alone. It could even be with a caregiver or family member. It could be to a long-term care facility. But a lot of patients sometimes, I almost feel sometimes when you discharge a patient with really no support to help them, it's almost like getting discharged from jail with, $100 saying have a good life. And it's tough for patients sometimes to, remember everything they have to do. They've got to pick up prescriptions. They've got to schedule with their primary care. They've got to make sure that they are getting their OT, their PT, and also that they're taking
coming from a hospitalist.
their hospital. Yeah,
usually
remember,
to
right.
A primary care doctor or a specialty doctor, or they're going to the admitting doctor at the nursing home. So there is a transition of care from hospitalist care to whoever's going to be taking over at the nursing home or in the community.
Right. And remember, in the hospital, I remember when my dad was hospitalized for almost 3 weeks, they wake you up to eat. They wake you up to pee. They wake you up to do whatever, to take blood, to take your medicine, to do everything. And so once you have to transition, especially if you're in the hospital longer, I'm even thinking 3 days, all of a sudden the patient's like, oh my gosh, and they get overwhelmed. So I love TCM, but okay, so here's my point. So when you transition out, there are rules on these codes. That's why they're paid almost like hospital admissions. They're paid, about anywhere from $178 to I think almost $250 or $300. It includes within 48 hours a call from that transitional care management provider that's going to bill it to the patient. They have to speak to them within 48 hours. Okay. So they can't just leave a message. If you don't get a hold of them, you got to try again. If a weekend, it's business days. So if a weekend is there, that you get that weekend thing. Or if they discharge on a Friday, you get until Monday or Tuesday. But the point is that I'm seeing practices trying to charge for that phone call. No, that's included. The next thing is that whether it be a moderate or high level patient, You also have to have an in-person visit, whether that be going to their home, coming into the office, whatever that is. And I would assume nowadays it can also be audio and video, but it still has to be a face-to-face with the patient. And I'm seeing people trying to charge for an office visit again, in addition to the TCM. No, that's included. I mean, think of all the money that would be for people with TCM, and that's what they're thinking. They're like, "Wow, I get this money plus I get a visit plus I get a phone call." No, no, no. And I'm just seeing that abused and building correctly. But here's the last problem. Then I'm going to send it to Paul, because Paul, you've got to be seeing this too. I think what my issue is here is that transitional care management says for patients who have moderate or high level psychosocial or medical problems that need this help. And that's not even listed in the information, that's not even documented. And the second thing is that if you don't have history with this patient, how do you know what they need? If the patient's admitted, let's say because they fell and broke their hip, and you have to help them, and it even says with all of their transitional services, and you just say, well, did you get your prescriptions? Great. And yet you think that's it? No, you have taken on that patient. That's why payers have woken up and said, let's see what you saw them prior to. So Paul, I'll throw it to you, because I don't know about you, but I'm seeing a lot of noncompliance with that service.
Well, you tend to know when there's a problem when you're getting a lot of questions about it, and it's exactly what you were seeing. It's, you know, it is hoped that as a primary care physician, you're being contacted on all of the issues that are going on with your patients. I think the biggest issue that we're seeing, or that I'm seeing, is that maybe they were in for a surgical admission, and for some reason, whether it's through sheer ignorance or it's just not following the paper trail of how that patient arrived at that admission, they're not doing a very good job of communicating when that patient has now been discharged. And, the primary care physician is being kept out of the loop when that patient goes back to their home or has additional needs. And what you said about the psychosocial portions of it, it is hoped that somewhere in that hospital record, here's where the social determinants of health come in, right? Because if they need psychosocial help at the time that they are discharged, you're hoping that somewhere in these heavily templated progress notes that we tend to see from hospitalist systems, that somebody is talking about social determinants of health, or you're not seeing the word none that affect care or something similar to that. That somebody is really making a solid statement within that hospital stay that, hey, their care is going, after discharge is going to be affected by X and Y and Z, and somebody better be following up on this. If that's missing, it's going to be very hard to make the argument by you as the transitional care management physician that this patient ever needed to receive the service in the first place.
This is one of those things.
Oh, go ahead, Scott. I'll go after.
No, I was going to say I think this is a great topic, and I could say this about a lot of different aspects of documentation, but I would rather you show me how you're doing it than telling me that it exists. And so one of the things I see a lot in TCM notes are these template statements about, well, the patient has this grave risk of rehospitalization, and that's why I'm doing this service. And then you go and you look, and the patient was in the hospital for like a sprained ankle, and they don't have any chronic conditions, and they're fine, right? And so I think all of these different things that come up as part of the TCM service, assistance with psychosocial needs, like I would rather you show me how you're doing that than just tell me that you're doing it, right? And because I think that there's no sense for what the necessity of it is, and it just becomes this statement of responsibility. But if the patient doesn't need the things, then you really shouldn't be billing the service, even if you're saying that, theoretically you're aware of the things, if that makes sense.
So that actually goes right into what I was going to bring up, Scott, and that's the medical necessity piece. And, I'm seeing this a ton, not just with TCM, but now, Terry, companies that I've seen and clients I've worked with that want to bring in TCM also want to know, okay, well, what's this RPM thing? Or now we have advanced primary care, which is supposed to cover a lot. And this one client I worked with last year, it was really frustrating because what it came down to was this discussion about medical necessity. I cannot go into any document, any regulation, guideline, whatever it is that we can find in writing. I cannot go in there and pull in black and white your argument for medical necessity. We need to see it in the workflow, not just the documentation, but the workflow. And I felt like that was a massive disconnect because what this particular company was doing, their end goal was awesome. And I could see the benefits and how that was going to help patients. But they basically just had a physician involved or a provider to check a box of a provider being there. And that is not the point of it. When you find something wrong and you hand it off to Paul's point, to the primary care provider at that point, what were you there for then?
Well, here's a question, right? So I think you raise an interesting question because you start talking about medical necessity, but you're asking it from a process standpoint, right? So when you're talking about defining medical necessity, let's just get that out of the way. When we talk about medical necessity, we're talking about services that have been performed in accordance with generally accepted standards of medical practice. These are services that have been peer reviewed. These are services that we are able to provide definitive guidance, definitive information, clinical studies, whatever it is that shows the efficacy of these services, that they don't constitute anything that would be investigational and or experimental. But I think you may have gotten some folks to scratch their head a minute because you started talking about medical necessity from a process standpoint. So can you take that a step further and talk about what you mean by
Mhm.
medical necessity from a process standpoint? And I'll open it up to anybody who wants to take that.
And I do have an example too. And it's funny because I've had people come up to me and ask me about companies that approach them. So let's take a step back to any service that's going to be ordered. When we are looking for the necessity of what the patient is going to receive, we need to see the problem identified. We need to see the treatment plan that's going to lay out, okay, what will happen as a result of this. So, with these types of services we're talking about, a lot of times the language and the guidelines we follow talks about the initiating visit. That's the point of that initiating visit. We're laying that groundwork for the why and who's going to take care of it and really, what's going to be done. So, where this becomes problematic when we have some of these organizations that only want to provide this piece, they are not looking at the patient holistically. So, for example, let's say if there's some kind of monitoring that's being done and they find that the patient consistently has issues with their high blood pressure, they want to tell the patient they have high blood pressure issues and the patient should call their PCP. Some are not even wanting to coordinate to make sure that is followed through to the very end. So the question is, okay, why were you there just to notify and you're not seeing it out through the end? And, this can happen too. Actually, Sean, I think it was at one of the rheumatology events that I was at last year or the year before. They basically were saying that there was a vendor there who wanted to be able to do like these mobile infusions and things like that, and they wanted to partner with the group. Folks, the reason they do this is because they need the physician's signature. They
That's
need the
right.
order. They're not carrying it through.
Yes.
You're taking on the risk.
Such a great point. Such a great point. Christine, I know you have a piggyback to that. And then I want to transition to one more thing because I also want to get into the last of the topics which Terry brought up, which is the digital e-visit. and I know that's probably a quicker, faster conversation, but go ahead, Christine, do that. And then I want to pivot with something that Scott and I have been dealing with.
Absolutely. So here's the thing. When I talk to providers and I use the term medically necessary, I always explain to them it's only part of the sentence. Yes, from your perspective, I have no doubt in my mind that everything that the provider is the physician is encouraging me to do is in my best interest. I have had a lot of genetic testing done, and I think it's phenomenal. However, my insurance has deemed that that is not medically necessary for them to pay for. It's not part of my policy. It's not part of what I negotiated with my insurance company. So respectfully, I pay that bill. Second, I talk to a lot of providers that say, listen, any doctor understands what I mean in that medical record. Unfortunately, until you hire a doctor who's just going to hand those claims over to the insurance company and explain what you mean, then we have to rely on these policies that are set in place that the documentation or of what was done supports the payment. That's what we're talking about. No one is ever questioning a doctor's clinical intervention. And by the way, if it does go litigious, let's say, God forbid, something goes wrong and they take one of these templated notes and they blow it up. Now you do have to hire an attorney and you have to hire a doctor who is going to read that note and explain what you meant, not actually what the documentation would be for a lay person or even a payer as the guidelines have been laid out. So, I just wanted to bring that back around. And it's funny that our next topic is the digital, because it is one of those things that I tell practices, you're probably doing a lot of virtual check-ins. You're probably doing some digital visits. And their answer to me is, well, that's too much work for us to keep up with in order to get reimbursed for it. We're just going to take a level 3 office visit, and bump it to a 4 to accommodate all those other things that happened in the background. And I cringe, because we've got systems in place to pay providers for the work that's done. The fact that they don't have the resources to make sure that it's accurately documented and reported, at no point in time should we give the green flag to just try to take it from another visit or add too much template to try to make it look like for another visit. So that's my take on all of that. Terry, I'm so excited to hear about the online visits.
Yeah, and Sean, we like hearing you talk from a mute button. That's my favorite. So we're going to talk about sorry. The only thing that Sean can really say to me is that he's younger than me, so I'm his older sister. Anyway, so the online visits are what they call digital e-visits, 99421 and 99423. This is something that it's interesting because there's twofold here. So what this is if you are, I don't want to say tech savvy, but if you're a patient that has a portal, you have to be an established patient, and you're able to sign in to your portal. You can get your lab results, and you can see your last visit. Don't forget, you're going to get a survey if you sign in, but if it's certain EMRs. But it's kind of nice. You can also pay online. Remember in the days when the only way to pay your medical bill was to get a statement in the mail and send a check. So, having access like that to your, not just your medical records, but, just to things that you want to see, you can see your prescriptions. You can put right in there, I need a refill. And it's just a great thing. I actually reminded my primary care doctor, because I use my portal on occasion. And I said, and it's back and forth. They said, don't forget to charge for this. I even gave him the code. And when I saw him in person, he's just like, hey, thanks. I didn't even know I could do that. But here are the rules here. First of all, it's a 7-day period. Okay. It also is very similar to audio only calls and things, where you can't have had a visit within the last 7 days that's related to that. So what it is something new's come up, or you're concerned about maybe an elevated level in your labs, and should you do something different in your treatment plan. And so you're having back and forth reciprocal correspondence with your physician. It's timed. So basically, it's over a 7-day period. So you'd have to have some kind of e-digital police in the office that is keeping that time, because I don't see the providers doing it. And it has to be from a provider who can bill directly to the payer. So it'd have to be a physician or QHP, not a medical assistant, not a go-between. So keep that in mind. But what I see with this sometimes is abuse of what it is. So one of the very large systems out there they post on LinkedIn, so I guess I can mention it. And I was like, why would you even post that on LinkedIn? It was Cleveland Clinic. They still have the post up, so I'm not talking at a turn. And they said, hey, we're going to start charging $50 to everybody who signs into their portal. I'm sure some of you saw that. And I went, what? Because they're giving public PSAs, so public statements about getting vaccines, all that. No, that's not what that's for. You can't charge people to give everyone the same, PSA comment on that. It's between you and your provider. It's a great thing the provider has, because how much, do they sit there and go back and forth with the patient? And, it kind of avoids them having to call them or chat with them. And the patient has to also prompt it. So they have to instigate it. And it's just a back and forth, and it's a total time in a given week. And so just take a look at those. Always read the directions in your CPT book on how to use it. So consider your CPT book a map, and you follow directions before you start using it. And I know, Sean,
Terry,
you
I
have
was
some less.
preparing some information on the final rule, and I know for most of us the final rule is old news, but there's a lot of new services that CMS has created HCPCS for expanding chronic care management, or to complement chronic care management. And it is to accommodate some of these things that happen behind the scenes. So to piggyback off what Terry said, I think it is very important that you have a coding liaison in your office that can go in and take a look at all of these little things that are happening in the background and be able to apply the appropriate code to it. Not only will you pay for that FTE person with the revenue that you're going to make, but also it means that nothing is getting left behind, and there's no need to worry about what other services, or how to pad a service, or how to increase a level of service, or get paid for a MIPS, when you've got this liaison who is capturing these reimbursable services that you're doing. But maybe, like Terry says, you don't have the time to chase the physicians and finding their time. Think about a coding liaison that can go in and really make sure that all of these things are happening correctly, and that you can capture those.
So, since Terry doesn't want to hear my voice today, I've unmuted myself for the last piece of this conversation. All right. So, Scott, the last thing that I want to talk about, because we were talking about vendors, right? And the fact that these vendors want physician signatures, they want physicians to buy their equipment, their services. So, we have a client that wanted to, and we're not going to talk about what the system is, but basically it's an adjunct to doing a orthopedic procedure. Fair enough?
That would be an accurate description.
Okay. So basically, because the system is considered to be investigational and or experimental, because there's no proven efficacy beyond the level that is required for the payers to say it's medically necessary, thus we're going to reimburse it. Here's a policy, here's a guideline, here's an LCD, whatever it is. During the all-staff meeting that transpired, the representative from this vendor was present. And he gave the guidance of what, Scott, in order for it to be paid?
To document the procedure as though you ordinarily would, using a template that they would provide, but omit the name of this particular vendor product, because they acknowledge that the payer will not cover it, but they also said that the payer did not understand exactly how it was being used in the performance of the work. So it's kind of like, we'll just not tell them. They don't
Yes.
understand any. It's
So-
too complicated for them, so we just won't tell them.
So basically, leave off what it is that you're actually doing, call it this, use this CPT code, and you're going to get paid for it. Just hope that you don't get audited. And oh, by the way, all of these huge health systems are doing the exact thing that we're telling you to do. So it must be okay if they're willing to do it. Folks, this is why when your providers come back to you as compliance professionals, as practice managers, administrators, leaders in your RCM departments, whatever it may be, this is why it's so critical to put a process in place, such as a vendor validation process, to prevent this kind of misbehavior, this kind of intent to defraud. This is not, if they got caught, this wouldn't be a False Claims Act violation. This most likely, after it was reviewed by a prosecutor in the civil division, they would most likely make a criminal referral, because this is the intent to create a scheme or an artifice. Under USC, I think it's 18 USC 1347, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud against the federal government. Folks, be careful. That's the message that I think we've been trying to give from the beginning of today's episode through right now, which is, if you're hired as a consultant, don't just be a yes person. Be the person that gives the proper guidance with sourced information that you can rely on. Not something that comes from an association or an academy who says, this is how we think it should be billed. It doesn't matter. Ask yourself, who do I follow? Well, the simple answer is, I follow the guidance of the entity that pays for my services, and that would
Right.
be the payers. So
Yeah,
go ahead, Scott.
no, I was going to add to that. When we talked a couple of minutes ago about chasing the provider's signature, I mean, the reason they're chasing the provider's signature is it's a handoff of the risk, right? Like, I'm verbalizing something to you, and all you got to do is sign here. And then it's like, here's the risk, you know?
Yep, that's a great point. All right, let me go around the horn real quick. Christine Hall, I'll start with you. Last words.
You know, it's always going to be the same words. You guys, the providers cannot afford not to hire consultants and knowledgeable people in the industry to provide you with good, solid guidance.
Paul?
I'm going to call out the AMA very briefly. Just because you create a code doesn't mean you can automatically build that code. And when you are introducing a code, rather than spending some time on indicating when it's used, try to think of a few instances where the misuse of that code would come into play, and give us those too, because providers need to hear that when that code is introduced, rather than finding out on the back end, gee, this wasn't really described well, and we don't have things that are coming through that describe this well. And now we're on the hook for it.
Great points. Stephanie Howard.
Yeah, so I'm going to piggyback on Christine, and I would suggest that when you bring external people in, consultants, even if you look at it as just an audit, you have to look at the whole picture. So we're not just looking at what's in a note in the codes. You got to look at the workflow, the EMR, everything that goes into it.
And last but not least, my buddy Terry Fletcher.
Hello. I would just say to the coders out there, you know, if you're somebody that's taken a second look at what the physicians are also coding and reporting, it's up to you to correct mistakes. So I see too much of the coders basically just repeating what the doctor says, same everything, same diagnoses, same codes, same modifiers, and not even in the right category of codes. So, you know, there's a reason you get your certification. There's a reason you're called a coder. You need to live up to the standard of that, you know, title.
It's great commentary. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of The Compliance Guy, our Monday auditing, coding, and compliance roundtable. Thank you so much to each and every single one of you who tunes in, logs on, and hangs out with us every couple of weeks as we get an opportunity to talk about our favorite topics of auditing, coding, and compliance. Terry Fletcher and I are going to be back tomorrow with an all-new hashtag Terry Tuesday episode. So until then, remember, be good to yourself, but more importantly, y'all be good to each other. Take care. All right.